gonna just say, welcome everyone. We'll be getting started in a few minutes. Hey, Matt.
Hello.
Matt, Isabel, Matthew Greek. I think you guys met on Zoom that day. I think we're going to have a very, Pat, maybe you can sit in the, yeah, I think we're going to have a very small audience. I'm just going to run to the restroom real quick.
Hello, RSVP.
For in-person we did, and two of the ones who were coming tonight are not feeling well. Mary Peterson is supposed to be here. We had more people reach out for the link than any other presentation, but far less who wanted to come in person or who registered to come in person. So,
did you see that someone had posted it in the Death Care Promotional Events Facebook page? Because that's probably why there were so many people who...
So I posted it in, so along with like all the community pages in this area, I did as many of the death care groups that I am a member of.
Yeah.
Because not only did I want people from, but I know that sometimes there are people who live like a half an hour away. I might not know them, but they're also on that group. You know what I mean? So it was for both. Totally. Yep. I'll be right back.
Wait, so what were the first two? That happened in the series?
Green Burial with Karen and Stories of an Undertaker.
Oh, nice.
Stories of an Undertaker.
What did you talk about?
I mean, I had to give some thought of what would be interesting. I wanted it to be funny, informative, and interesting. So I talked, from my life as a funeral director, what it looks like on the family, to some funny stories, funny requests people have had. And then I always open it like half of it for Q&A because there's so many questions. So we covered a lot. And that was the first one that we recorded and live streamed. So it was good attendance.
That's awesome.
How are you, sir?
Right.
Welcome back.
Last of the
Can
year.
I show you Karen?
Yeah.
So you don't even need
Oh,
to
of
walk
course.
in, just like drag from the corner and just...
All right, I will totally get a picture
Thank
or two
you.
of you.
I appreciate it.
And what are we doing on time? It's 6:30, right? 6:31. Let's see if we can see how many people.
Did we figure that out? How to get analytics?
Well,
7 on the side, but 2 of those are probably on me.
okay. Yeah, I think that's good. All right,
Yeah,
just give
let's
me,
start.
should we get started?
Yeah, if you want them waiting.
Okay, all right. Wait, you're right there, sir.
Get some vodka?
All right, I'm gonna make a plug. All right, we're live, right? All right. Okay. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us, those who are viewing from home, and welcome to everyone who's here in the room. I just wanted to mention, so we are live streaming from Greco Funeral Home in Kennett Square, Pennsylvania, and Greco Funeral Home, the owner, Matthew Greco, is also the owner of Naugle Funeral Home in Quakertown, Pennsylvania. So if any of you are in northeastern Pennsylvania or north of Philadelphia, we are affiliated, Greco and Naugle. We have death cafes at both of the funeral homes. The one here in Kennett Square is the second Monday of every month, and the death cafe at Naugle Funeral Home in Quakertown is the third Thursday. So if you're in the vicinity, please join us for one of the death cafes. We have a great time, and we usually have a really nice turnout. We'd love to see you. The other thing that I would like to mention is Isabel, who is here with us tonight, is part of our Living and Dying Well speaker series. This is the third month in a row that we are offering presentations. The first month we did a presentation on green burial. Last month we had Stories of an Undertaker with Matt Grieco. And tonight we are thrilled to have Isabel Knight from the National Home Funeral Alliance here speaking to all of us in Kennett Square and around the country. So Isabel is the president of the National Home Funeral Alliance. If you have not looked them up on the internet, please do. Lots of information on their website. And I'll just mention that next month our final speaker in the series is Lilith Baugh, who will be speaking about healthy grieving and what that looks like. So stay tuned on Facebook and emails for information about that. Without further ado, Isabel Knight.
Thank you. That was a great introduction. All right, so welcome everyone. So as Karen mentioned, I'm the president of the National Home Funeral Alliance, which is an organization that educates people about home funerals and helps to give them resources to do home funerals if that is something that they want to do. And so one of the things I like to start off with is just giving a brief history of why home funerals are even a thing. And part of that starts with looking at what even is sort of the funeral industrial complex, and what, home funerals are basically the thing that we used to do before, that was ever a thing. So the way a lot of people talk about this story is in starting with the Civil War, right? So pre-Civil War, funerals looked a lot like what a home funeral would look like today in terms of what we're advocating for, but it was much more entrenched in our society. People actually had coffin doors built into their homes. It was part of our architecture. There was all kinds of ways in which funerals were actually built into the fabric of our society. But because of the Civil War, there was an increase in popularity of embalming, because that was something that people had to do to bring soldiers back home from war, to preserve their loved ones and to preserve the people who had died. And so that is what gave rise to some of the modern embalming practices today. And from that, there was a whole wave of professionalization that happened. And what's interesting is that this industry wasn't even really regulated until about 1984. So there was like over 100 years in which that was something that, prior to the funeral rule, which is the main regulation in this space, it was a totally unregulated industry, and it was something that many of you may have heard of Jessica Mitford's The American Way of Death, and that was sort of like the silent spring of the funeral industry. And so after that, there were a lot of people who were calling for more regulations, and so that is sort of what gave rise to some of what the space looked like today in terms of regulations of the funeral industry. And now, as of, in 2010, the National Home Funeral Alliance was formed. And so now there's sort of this wave of people who are really interested in, taking a lot of the things that would be done in a funeral home and bringing it back into their own homes and doing a lot of that ritual and body care at home. So this is basically these are some of the main elements of what happens in a home funeral. So a home funeral, and something that we also refer to it is as community death care, because it doesn't always happen in a home. This happens for people who don't have homes as well. And it can involve a funeral director as well. In some states, it's actually required to involve a funeral director to do things like paperwork or transportation. But basically, it involves any level of funeral director involvement as a family or a community would like, and it can involve things like filling out paperwork, such as the application for a death certificate, transportation, so if someone dies in a hospital, bringing that person home for the home funeral, any kind of body care, such as washing and shrouding, and any level of ceremony or ritual that the family or community would like, as well as potentially making a shroud, making a casket. It really allows you to do all of this very DIY, if that's something that you would like. And then once the home funeral is over, instead of having a funeral director arrange for a disposition, you can have, basically yourself, you can take your loved one or the person who has died to a crematory or to a burial ground yourself. And so those are all conventional elements of what a home funeral looks like today. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about what are some of the reasons why people want to do this. So in some cases, it's about basically being able to maintain control over the situation, especially because during COVID, for example, there were a lot more policies and regulations sort of put in place around what families were able to do. There were limits on how many people could be in buildings, things like that, right? And then there are also a lot of people who find that being able to bring somebody home really helps with the grieving process, can help to just allow people to take some time. And that can be a really beautiful experience for a lot of people. And there are also people who do home funerals for affordability reasons. Technically speaking, like the main thing that you would need is ice in order to, keep someone at home for, a day or two. And other than that, there are so many ways that you can use items that were already in the home to do some of that body care and ritual that I was mentioning. So, you might use a bed sheet as a shroud. You might be able to, have candles or use like shampoo that was already, in the bathroom for some of that body care piece. And it can also be environmentally friendly, especially when paired with, other sustainable and natural death care options like green burial, which was the topic of the first presentation in this series. So, and that is something that we see very commonly, is that a lot of the people who are interested in things like home funerals are also interested in things like green burial. So one of the sort of groups of people that we serve at the National Home Funeral Alliance are home funeral guides, and these are people who can help families in terms of education and advocacy around some of those home funeral pieces. So they can't actually do any of the hands-on caring for a body in the home, because that is something that in many states is considered a licensable activity, which means that you need a funeral director to do those things. But there's a lot of work around, as you can imagine, doing a lot of that planning work that goes into a home funeral that can be very much like you can use a home funeral guide to help you with a lot of those pieces. So, for example, one of the barriers that home funeral families have to tackle is addressing hospital release policies, because if you die in a hospital, it may very well be that they don't necessarily know, they're not familiar with the concept of home funerals, and they don't necessarily know that it's everyone's legal right to bring their person home with them to do community death care or to do a home funeral in every state. And so there's a lot of things that when you're prepping to do something like a home funeral, it's really helpful to be able to do a lot of that planning in advance and like call the hospital and make sure you understand, okay, like what are your policies around releasing somebody to go back home. And so here are some images to just give you a sense of what this can look like. So I have some photos of people doing hands-on, like washing a body. This is like a picture of somebody who is being buried in just a shroud with, all natural biodegradable materials. And this is a family that has their own homemade casket that they had in their home with them as they did their ritual. And actually, this is a picture of one of our we're currently, as an organization, in the process of building out a lot of educational materials to help people to understand if they want to do home death care, how can they do it themselves, and like what can they learn to do just with free resources on the internet with a home funeral guide. And so this is actually a picture of our former president Angela showing people how to do a dental tie so that you can keep someone's mouth closed. And so this is just to give you a sense of like what does it actually look like in practice for people. And then, so one of the things I mentioned was hospital release policies. Now I'm going to talk about what are some things to think about in advance if this is something that you yourself might be interested in. So one of them is filing paperwork and getting the appropriate permits, which is also something that varies by state. So if that's something that you would like to do yourself as opposed to engaging with a funeral director, that is definitely something you should research. So I just attached, this is an example of an application for a death certificate. And I just like to show people so that they can see, like, it can seem like a very daunting thing, but it's really like you're filling out a form. And one reason why it might be helpful in some states to engage a funeral home to help you with these things is because there's this thing known as the EDRS, the Electronic Death Record System, and that's something that allows funeral homes to process these forms digitally, and otherwise you probably would have to go to your local vital statistics office, the town clerk, but it is something that many home funeral families do. And then there is also a piece of paperwork known as the burial transit permit that you would need to, transport someone from the home to the place of disposition. So like those are just two pieces of paperwork that I try to at least let people know exist so that they can go find out if you're trying to do this at home in your own state, what does that look like? What office do I have to go to? Where can I get some of that paperwork and how do I file it? And then another thing that we commonly hear from people is basically just discomfort around the notion of like having to be around a dead body. And that is totally understandable. We live in a very death-phobic culture. And one of the things that we also try to just, educate people about is the notion that there is no like elevated health risk to people who are performing body care at home. There are very few diseases that you can catch from doing that kind of body care. Some of them are like Ebola, and usually that will be something that in advance that is, you're not going to be able to do a home funeral in that case. But it's perfectly safe in the vast majority of cases to be doing home death care, such as washing and shrouding yourself. Another thing that people sometimes run into as a barrier is how to transport. So there's a lot of people who have been trying to figure out like where can I rent from if I don't have a car that's big enough to help me do the transport. Companies like U-Haul do not allow you to take someone home in a U-Haul, but there are definitely ways that people can figure out. You don't necessarily need to. There are transportation companies that can help you with that as well, for sure. But there are definitely ways that people find to figure out how to do it themselves. And then the last piece is just, understanding this is all regulated state by state. So understanding the legal regulations in your state is something that can be definitely something that requires some prep work and research. And so that is something that we at the National Home Funeral Alliance is one of the biggest resources that we provide, is a list of regulations state by state. And so this is just a screenshot of some of the questions that we try to answer for people. So we answer questions like, are there things that you legally need a funeral director for in your state? There are some states that you are required to engage a funeral director. How long do you have before you're required to basically go through a disposition, which is basically a burial or cremation? And are there any kinds of preservation time requirements? Are there is there a period of time before which you have to basically either embalm or use refrigeration or put someone on ice, things like that? Is embalming required? That is one thing that people often ask, and that usually in most states is only required when you are transporting someone across state lines via like a plane. And then is there a mandatory wait time for cremation? And a lot of states typically have that just because you need to, cremation is considered like an irreversible process. And so in those cases, if there's for any reason, you needed to have some kind of like autopsy, or there was some sort of like, worry about foul play or something like that, that's why those sort of exist, is so that you can be able to, just make sure that everything is in order before you're doing something like cremation. So those are some of the most common questions that we get asked around legal requirements by state. And so that is something that we provide as a resource for free on our website, listed by state. And so one of the other things that people often talk about is price. Obviously you can do as elaborate of a home funeral as you would like. And so in that case, it doesn't necessarily provide cost savings to people. But it definitely does allow for people to do a low-cost funeral if that is something they want. And the reason I share these cremation prices is just because one of the biggest expenses for home funeral families is the actual disposition itself. And so I always like to just share cremation prices as well as burial prices for the basically the lowest cost option, which is either a direct cremation or immediate burial, to let people know, just give people a sense of like what are the kinds of costs that they might have to expect if they were to do a home funeral, on top of the cost of things like ice. So that can definitely provide cost savings for people who want to be able to do everything themselves without the help of a funeral home. But obviously that's something that you can engage. You can very much do a hybrid option. You can mix and match. And the last thing I wanted to share with you all was just an example of one of the resources that we provide. And this, we're not going to go into like all of the, here's like, the hundreds of things that you might want to do. But this is just an example of a sort of checklist around if you do want to wash a body at home, what are some of the steps that we help people think through in order to do that? So things like preparing warm water and soap, potentially with essential oils, using a washcloth to just wash the body, and then if you're doing a home viewing, you can use dry ice. There's also this thing known as Techni ice that you can use, which is sort of like having ice packs kind of in a bubble wrap format so that the water doesn't leak out. And basically we explain things like how do you prepare something like this at home, whether it's like on a table or on some kind of like a massage table and things like that, to be able to prepare a space that feels comfortable to you, feels comfortable to any of the people who might be grieving this person. So this is just an example of some of the kinds of resources we provide to people who are thinking of trying to figure out how to do this themselves. So with that, I kind of that's pretty much the main thing that I have prepared. And I was wondering if anyone had any questions at this point about what any of the logistics, anything that I spoke about, or anything totally new.
So I'm going to read questions from here, but maybe you can repeat them because I don't know how much my voice will carry.
Totally.
Ashley has a question about transporting bodies to another state.
Mm-hmm.
And then she's also asking about burial on private property, which is
Mm-hmm.
not,
Yeah.
I'll let you speak to that. So she says, what are the rules for transporting the body to another state?
Mm-hmm.
And then she says, for burial on private property. So that's,
Yeah.
yeah.
So in terms of transporting to another state, that's something that you can do, and that's something that in some cases, it depends on basically how you're getting the person there, whether it's via air versus a car. And so usually you just want to pay attention to, do they require embalming for that process? Like that's like the main thing that you would want to pay attention to if you are thinking of transporting someone to another state. And typically there are airlines, it's more about airline policy itself. And there are definitely airlines out there that don't require embalming if that's not something that you want. And so that's kind of, I don't know if there was a more specific question around the transportation to a different state. And then what was the second part of the question?
It was about burial on private property.
Oh, okay.
So,
Yeah.
yeah.
So, okay, so sorry, I forgot to repeat the question again. But
That's okay.
yeah, so basically if the person asks, can you bury on private property? And that is something that is very local. It could be even state by state, but it could be county by county in terms of what those laws and regulations look like. So there are a lot of places that do allow that on private property. One thing I would advise people to at least research when they're looking into what their own local jurisdiction allows and doesn't allow is there are some places that will allow you to do it at home without. Almost always you'll be able to figure out how to do it in some way. It's just a matter of, do you have to zone it as a family cemetery or not, and how does that zoning process work? But there are some cases when you have to worry about basically if you sell the property, what happens? Do you have to basically, there are some states and counties where if you sell the piece of property where someone is buried, you are required to disclose, and then the person who is buying the property might basically ask you to disinter the body. And so that is just something to also be aware of when you're doing your research into what does that look like in your jurisdiction.
So a follow-up from Ashley. She says the transportation to another state would be by car. And she says, how do we find out the rules for each state?
Oh, okay, I see. So basically, you look at the state that you're leaving and the state that you're going to, and so the first thing that will usually come up if you Google this kind of a question is this website called NOLO. And so NOLO actually, I think, has really good up-to-date advice on things like that, of like, what are the laws around things like, transporting someone to a different state. So I have not had any issues with that website. So like that would basically be my recommendation, is to like Google it, and that's probably going to be the first thing that comes up. And they can then direct you. They do a really good job of citing the specific state, like basically the place where the law is written, so that you can go read the law and also like, see for yourself if you agree with their interpretation of what it's saying. So that's what I would recommend. But you can also call if you have like, it's usually called something like the Department of Vital Statistics, the health department, things like that, is what I would generally look up if you had to Google this for yourself.
And Isabel, you're saying the name of that website is NOLO?
Yeah.
N-O.
NOLO.
Okay.
Yeah, and they're all written by this woman named Valerie, who I've never met, but she writes them for every state, and she seems like she's really good at citing her sources.
Okay, very
Yeah.
good. So I think that helps Ashley. So Bethany wants to know, what have you encountered with judgment from people who haven't heard of home funerals? And then maybe I'll let you answer that, and then I'll tell you her second question. So what have you encountered with judgment from people who, I guess, haven't heard about this, and those kinds of typical reactions that maybe some of those folks?
Yeah, so I mean, it's been across the spectrum. Like, obviously, there are some people who would never want to do body care at home, and that's totally fine. That's something that is 100% up to your personal preferences. One thing that I think people often assume about the National Home Funeral Alliance is that we are anti-funeral director because, we are giving people resources to do funerals at home. And one thing I will say around that, I know that might not have been what she was asking about per se, but that's totally not the case. Like, we absolutely believe that one of the main ways for more people to be able to get access to home funerals is to have more home funeral friendly funeral homes. And so we really strongly advocate for, people doing whatever feels most comfortable for them. And if you don't want to do, an element of it, absolutely hire someone to do it. That is absolutely what you should do. Don't do things that you don't feel comfortable with. And we don't have any level of, we don't really believe in a should, right? We don't believe that everyone should do a home funeral, or that you should, not embalm or do green burial or whatever it is. We are very pro everyone doing the death care option that is right for them. Our main goal is to just make sure that people know that people know that this is an option in the first place, and that they feel empowered to do that if it's something that they want to do.
So her second question is, how do you provide education to family and friends who might be attending the home funeral? And I think she's getting at people who might be uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. So how do you, prepare them, so to speak, I guess?
Totally.
Yeah.
So one thing that I would recommend to anyone who might be attending a home funeral and isn't sure what to expect is to listen to the National Home Funeral Alliance's podcast called A Path Home. So that is a podcast that we host that just tells people stories of people who have had home funerals before. And there's such a wide diversity, as you would expect, because people, when people are empowered to do things themselves, they can come up with such a wide variety of what a funeral can look like. And so there's so many different examples of, cases where you might think the person, my person wanted to donate organs or donate their body to science. What does that look like in the case of a home funeral? All of those cases and those stories are told in that way. And I think it just makes it so much more accessible to people to hear those stories. Because, yes, people are often can be nervous about the idea of not knowing what to expect, right? Because it is something that is not mainstream, is not necessarily the conventional way to do a funeral. And so I think just hearing people's stories, talking about everyone pitching in and deciding, to give everyone a role. Even there's so many examples where the kids can get involved, the community, the neighbors can get involved. Even if you don't necessarily know how to do something shrouding, or if you don't want to do something like that, I think really allows them, because they're contributing something, to be able to also feel as if, I think often when someone dies, you have this sense of I want to be able to help, but I don't necessarily know how, and being able to contribute in that way, I think can be really gratifying for you as a griever as well. So even if it's just helping people find parking during the, just feeling as if you are an active participant in this thing that you're usually just an observer for. So that's one thing that I would say is listen to some of those stories, just to hear how, how human it is and how very much a customizable thing it is for each person. And you can really do it any way that you would like.
I'm putting the name of the podcast in the chat as well, but in any case, Kyle is asking, is it hard to find a funeral director who is willing to help or advise on a home funeral? think that in some areas that might be hard to find, but I hope I'm wrong. So,
Okay.
any advice on that?
Sure. Yes, well, we are in a funeral home right now, and yes, so that they absolutely exist. So the question was, are there ways to find a funeral director who is home funeral friendly to help you with this process? And the answer is yes. We actually have a directory on our website. If you go to the website of the National Home Funeral Alliance, we have a directory of any kind of home funeral provider, whether it be a home funeral guide, whether it's home funeral friendly funeral directors, whether it's people who make shrouds. So that is one place that you can look. But if you have a funeral home, one thing that we always encourage people to do is that if you already have a funeral home in mind that maybe your family has historically worked with already, and even if they don't necessarily advertise that they are home funeral friendly, you can always ask and say, hey, like, what would your rates be for just helping us with, transportation or something along those lines, right? Or maybe you are a family that wants to do embalming and then have that person be at home. Like, there's so many different combinations of ways that you can make it work. So one reason I recommend that people do that is because I think it then highlights to funeral directors that there is a demand for home funerals. And I really hope that as more people do that and try to let their providers that they already work with know that this is something that they want, then that will popularize more funeral directors being home funeral friendly and realizing that it's not a competition thing. It's like, actually, we can have an offering that we otherwise wouldn't be able to capture this population of clients, basically. But there is a lot of ways in which funeral directors can help home funeral families. So that's what I would recommend.
Beautiful, thank you. Actually, real quick, do you see this message? YouTube is not receiving.
Do any of you in the live audience have any questions? Okay.
Yeah, sorry. So Ashley is now asking, is embalming mandatory? I think you already addressed this, but.
So it is not mandatory. It may be many places policy, right? For example, some funeral homes will require embalming if you want to do a viewing, like an open casket viewing. And some airlines might require embalming if you want to use them to transport from one state to another, or not even from one state to another, but just to transport somebody. And so it is not, most of the time, there is no requirement for it, but it may be up to each individual vendor's policies to require it in some cases.
So I have a concern as a funeral director.
Sure.
I wanted to hear all this. I mean, I've been with Karen observing what you were going to talk about on some level. But
Yeah.
So if we were engaged, and the law in Pennsylvania, and maybe I'm missing something myself, is to embalm if there's an open casket, and we go to a home funeral to assist in some level on dry ice. Not sure if I'm following my own laws as a funeral director. So
Yeah.
what have you observed in that? What's the hybrid way for a funeral director to be involved with a dry ice situation at the house?
Can you repeat that question, Isabel?
Yes, I can repeat the question. So the question was, if there are laws in the state that apply to funeral directors that require embalming for a viewing, for example, does that then apply in the case of a family that's doing a home funeral? So I actually don't think I have encountered that question. There's been a lot of people who have asked me about, okay, there are laws in many states that only apply to funeral directors, and a lot of people have asked me, does that then apply to a home funeral family? And the answer to that is no. But does it apply to a funeral director that is helping assist in a home with a family?
Well, I can do my own research on
Yeah, that I don't know the answer to.
And it may be that if we are privately assisting, It's an invite only to the house. That makes, so now it's not a public funeral.
Right.
So the key word may be public funeral.
Right.
Which is what I've always told my clients. Because I have families say goodbye to a loved one all the time without involvement.
Right.
But it's private.
Right.
So that may be the workaround, and I can do my own research.
Sure. I mean, obviously a funeral home is on private property, but in the cases where it's applying to a public viewing, I assume it always applies to the funeral home, at the very least.
As you just said earlier, cremation, refrigeration, embalming, or burial, all within 24 hours. So I can offer all those things.
Right.
But the key piece is viewing the body publicly. It's supposed to be embalmed.
Right.
So they didn't say a fifth word or on
Sure.
dry ice.
Sure.
In Pennsylvania.
Sure. So yeah, that's something I don't know the answer to. I'm sorry.
These nuances.
Yes, I mean, there's always things like that where someone, recently was like, oh, well, what happens when you have someone who had an autopsy and they have a viscera bag and they want to do green burial? There's always cases like that come up and you're just like, oh my gosh, very specific question, and I have to go figure out what the answer to that is.
For sure. Isabel, because we are in Pennsylvania, and I think the majority of our viewers are in Pennsylvania, can you talk about what the rules are? Like, how many days can you keep someone at home in Pennsylvania?
Yeah, honestly, that is something I don't have memorized. I always have to go back to the state requirements page to figure it out.
But that would be on the website.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes, that is on the website.
That's cool.
I really should have it committed to memory. But I mean, that actually may be something that you could answer as a funeral director.
Well, okay, yeah, Pennsylvania, it's after 10 days, we have to notify the state that we're keeping a body longer. But I would assume technically it should apply to the family doing their own thing.
Yeah, so I think that generally my understanding of Pennsylvania is that people kind of call Pennsylvania like the Wild West with respect to a lot of, it's not a very strict state compared to a lot of other states when it comes to those sorts of requirements. You don't think so? You disagree? Okay.
I will call it an old school state.
Sure.
With a lot of old funeral home laws.
Yeah.
That do need to be interpreted and fixed. So,
Yeah.
I don't know, I go both ways on that. I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
Now, is the Alliance, are you the only Alliance branch, or is this across the country?
Yeah, so it's national, and so I don't know how familiar you are with the Funeral Consumers Alliance. And the question was, are we the only branch?
Of the home burial.
Yeah, of the National Home Funeral Alliance. And so, yeah, we are basically the national organization, and we don't have a chapter model in the same way that, for example, the Funeral Consumers Alliance does. And we also have members from outside of the United States as well. We have lots of people from Canada. We have people from Australia and New Zealand. There's people all over the world. And actually, I think New Zealand just came up with their own basically equivalent of the National Home Funeral Alliance, which is very exciting to see.
Are you a paid staff?
These cropping up. No, we only have one paid staff. We are an all-volunteer board, and we are always looking for more board members. So if anyone listening is really interested in any of the things that I've been talking about, yeah, we are an all-volunteer board, and it is literally all of the work that you see on our website is fueled by volunteer hours. So it's people on the ground, looking up their own state legislation, and we're actually putting out a workbook this month in April, or at the end of the month, so probably more like May, where we actually, it's more of a guidebook, but basically it's a book that has all of the information that you need to do. I mean, obviously I can't say things like all, but that has a lot of the information that you need around washing, shrouding, and we go into a lot of detail. We even have an addendum that's going to come, in parallel to it that specifically addresses child, perinatal, and prenatal infant death. if you're doing that as a home funeral. So we have quite a bit of detail in all of those resources, and all of those resources that are about to come out were created by volunteers. So yes, that's the answer to your question.
Nice. I was just going to mention that Patrick, who's here, attended a home funeral for his aunt a year ago, and I don't know if you want to say anything, and maybe Isabel can repeat it for the people. Just any.
It was in Vermont. She wanted to be buried at home.
Or she wanted to be kept at
Kept
home.
at home.
Yeah.
We had techniites. We used that.
Mm-hmm.
She was on hospice at home, so she was pretty much, people that came to visit her, she was in her bed, and she stayed in her bed. And it was in a separate room, and people would come, and they had a sitting area for her to sit with her, and then they would, after they had spent their time with her, they were going to another room, and it was a celebration. People came over and cooked, and there was about 30 of us, talking and singing and having dinner with her in the other room.
Mm-hmm.
It was really nice.
Yeah, I was actually realizing I should probably just pass the mic, but yeah, that sounds really beautiful. Yeah, I mean, actually, really one of the things that, so one of the things mentioned was that, basically, it was your aunt, you said? Yeah, his aunt was able to sort of stay at home in the bed, and they used techniice, and basically, like, they did a whole ceremony basically around the bed. And that is one thing that also is quite nice, I think, about also doing a home funeral, is that I think oftentimes people feel a sense of urgency when someone has died to, like, okay, I gotta call the funeral home, like, get them out. And one of the things that we really like to encourage for people is just, death is not an emergency. You can take as much time as you want and as much time as you need. And that's one of the things that I think can be really nice about not necessarily needing to transition to a different space, right? You can stay in the same space that, you were doing in your vigil.
Over 3 days.
Right. Yeah.
So that was, that was very nice.
Yeah.
Very nice.
Yeah.
And we're fine to wait to come pick up the body.
Totally. But I'm sure you have also experienced, like, that phenomenon of people feeling this urgency,
people,
right?
Yeah, there's no rush. We tell them all the time.
Right.
Because it gives us more time to breathe a little bit too.
Totally. So yeah, the home funeral that we're talking about was able to take place over 3 days, and it can just be a very, unrushed time where you can take the space. And, a lot of people find that to be really sacred, spiritual, like having that space to be able to be at home as well. And so even outside of, like, in a secular context, like, it doesn't really matter. I feel like those things also, just being able to create any level of ceremony and ritual that you would like, is something that can be really, honestly, a fun and creative process when you're planning a home funeral, is figuring out, like, okay, like, what music am I going to play? Like, how can I curate this space in the way that I would like? So,
Yeah, the key word that we've developed over the last 15 years of my 25 years in funeral service is participating in your grief. So what you're describing is participating at a very high level. And even in our funeral home in Quakertown, we've brought in a sleigh bed for people to come in and say goodbye to mom and dad.
I'll just give this to you as you're talking.
There we go.
Yeah, I think that would help.
So yeah, we talk about participation in our funeral homes, and the home funeral gives people the ability to participate at a very high level. And so at our funeral home in Quakertown, we've even gone to the extent of installing a sleigh bed. So that's where the deceased would be laid out for a private goodbye in a more home-like feeling setting, not a stretcher or a casket or a table. So we, at least as a funeral home, are very progressive in participation, and then the home funeral, falls right into that mindset. So when you're looking at how do you involve a funeral home in a hybrid way, we at least get it. And there's ways to engage and participate and not have headaches or nightmares because you didn't know this or that or the other thing. We're here as a resource too. So.
Absolutely. And that's one thing that I think and hope that is happening with more funeral homes. And I think that is because, we talk to people who are in mortuary schools and people who are excited about doing home funerals. And I just think that there are more and more progressive funeral homes that currently exist and that are, coming to be in the space where people are happy and excited to help you create that participatory space. One of the things, so a lot of people who are kind of in the death care space really like this woman named Caitlin Doty, and she has a section in her book where she talks a little bit about her book called Smoke Gets in Your Eyes, where she talks a little bit about working at a funeral home, and she talks a little bit about how families that can basically have basically be around more dead bodies is like one of her main mantras. And it's something that many people report being, obviously not everyone, but there is quite a lot of people who, when they feel as if they can do something, I don't really love using the word closure, but it really allows you to feel it's healing, right?
We don't use closure anymore either.
Yeah.
We say healing.
Healing, yeah, absolutely. Because there is something that, this is drifting more into the green burial space, but there's a lot of people who describe to me, for example, the feeling of when you're participating in filling in a grave and hearing the first shovelful of dirt hit the casket, right? A lot of people just describe that experience as being very healing in ways that are not necessarily obvious, right? Why that would be the case, but it can be really just helpful for people to be able to have that sense of healing and finality and whatever it is that they're looking for out of their grief process, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Isabel, we had a question about whether or not people would be able to get your slides.
Yes.
Yeah?
Yes.
You already emailed them to me.
Yeah.
So I'll tell people that they can email me.
Yes.
Is that okay?
Absolutely.
And I'll just forward them to them if they want them?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
So right now I'm showing a screen that you almost certainly cannot read because this is just my resources page, but I'm sure this is one of the most useful slides for people because I do link a lot of other resources for people that are, home funeral related, but also there's so many different resources that exist out there, whether it's Green Burial Council, that is a group that just educates people about green burial, and they also have an arm that actually does certifications that they go to cemeteries and see if they, basically meet all of their requirements for what a green burial should be. And then one of the organizations I mentioned already was the Funeral Consumers Alliance. So that's a nonprofit that basically tries to promote, one of the main issues that they are trying to promote more knowledge and awareness about is pricing transparency within funeral homes. So one of the main initiatives that they actually have engaged in for many years now, and it only recently came to sort of fruition, is that they are lobbying the FTC, which is the body that basically enforces the funeral rule, to require funeral homes to post their prices online. Currently, you in every state except for California, that's not a legal requirement. You can call, you can come in person and get prices, but they're not available online in most places. That's not really a norm within the funeral space. And so that is something that they actually are considering right now. They just had a public comment period in January to ask people whether this is something that an amendment to that funeral rule that they would like implemented. So that's one of the things that the Funeral Consumers Alliance does. The AARP, the Order of the Good Death, or some other ones, and then Philly specific, but there's this group called Death Party PHL that has events, and there's a Death Cafe group in Philadelphia as well that is fully virtual now, and so every time I go, there's actually people from all over the world there, not just from Philadelphia. And then there's a group. The only co-op funeral home in the United States is called People's Memorial Association, which is actually based in Washington State. And they started off actually as or actually I think they were a precursor to the Funeral Consumers Alliance, but they are also heavily partnered with the Funeral Consumers Alliance. But they are like, I think an unprecedented, or not even unprecedented, but there are no other co-ops in the U.S., as far as I know, co-op funeral homes, and so they do a lot of really great education on their website as well.
It's actually a funeral home?
Yes, actually. They,
Co-op funeral.
correct. They started off as just sort of like a buyer's co-op, in the sense that they would just negotiate contracts like with funeral homes, and then they eventually, they've been around since like 1930, so they, which is partially why I think that like they have been able to exist and as a co-op, because like there have been people who have been trying to talk about starting a co-op funeral home in Philadelphia, and it's just like super hard. Because most co-op models, like, you know, people see like grocery stores and things like that. You're going to the grocery store like once a week, you know, and so like co-op models really rely on continued engagement, right? And so that's something that I think is part of the reason why they've been able to really pull it off, is that they have been doing this for so long, and they have a huge, robust network of people who are on their mailing list and who regularly donate to them. Yeah. So they're awesome. I definitely recommend that people check them out. But yes, I will send out slides. Just so that people are aware, this deck has like a million other things in here that I just put everything basically in one giant mega deck. So that's just a selection. They're gonna get all of this stuff too.
Okay.
Yeah. So I also do, you know, funeral pre-planning workshops. I do green burial workshops. I do all kinds of things like that. So you're gonna get it all.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very good. Mary, did you have any questions?
Not a question, but a comment. It came up today. I
Yeah.
have 2 daughters and a son.
Oh, here.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
Oh, whatever. I have 2 daughters and a son who lives overseas, and neither of my daughters were available to come tonight, but I said, you know, I'm going to this thing tonight that I'm very interested in, and I always have been. And I said, but really it's more about you than me, because when I'm going, it's up to you guys what you want to do. And we laughed about it and talked, and she goes, yeah, that would be so cool. She goes, I could just envision that. Because my home has sort of been a gathering place for a lot of ages, a lot of situations for a long time. And we got into this whole funny discussion about it. She goes, that is really an awesome idea. So, and I think if people could look at it that way, as a personal thing, and we are so uncomfortable with death as a society, that I think just by culture we've taken it away from families instead of kind of giving it back. And my heritage is Irish, and I grew up going to Irish wakes, and it wasn't scary. It was a positive thing, kind of like the story with your aunt. You know, and I worked in hospice in Vermont, and in Vermont, people are very much into keeping things personal and keeping it at home, and whatever. We'll see what happens. Thank you. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, absolutely. No problem. Yeah, that is something that, so outside of my work with the National Home Funeral Alliance, I also do end-of-life planning for people, and that is one of the things that so routinely people either, when they hear about what I do, they say, oh, like that's so morbid, like that must be depressing, that must require a lot of emotional labor, things of that ilk. And really, it's such a life-affirming job. You know, it's something where, like, when you are sitting down to plan your funeral, like, you're just thinking, like, the questions that come up are just like, what is my favorite music? Who are the people that I like? What are the, sacred objects that I have that I want to be in the room with me? And those are incredibly fun conversations, and also just, like, that, I think, really it's really about life, right? And so that is something that I really hope that from a cultural perspective we can really shift, because I work with people who are, many of the people I work with are young. And they are, when they sit down and be like, okay, let me try to plan my funeral now. So many of them are like, oh, I want to do this now, right? I want to have like a celebration of life now because all of these things sound so fun. And so like one of the people that I've been working with is saying like, she was like, okay, I'm trying to plan like an open mic portion of my funeral, but I also want to have, and I thought this was a really creative, fun idea. She was like, I want to have a photo booth / confessional where people can go into the photo booth and, if they want to say something to her that they don't want to say in, say, an open mic setting, they can just sit down and like write her a letter, or they can have a computer there that just has like literally photo booth open on the computer and record a video for her in the photo booth. So I just thought that was such a cool idea, and people just come up with these incredibly like creative and honestly like inspirational things when they're planning things like their celebration of life or their legacy projects and things like that. So it's just, there's obviously grief and there's obviously parts of it that are really difficult, but it's also very fun. Yeah. So I don't know, were there any other questions?
I think that's it from online, and many people are saying, this was awesome, thank you so much, this is great. So lots of very positive comments and lots of thanks. Yeah. Anybody else? Yeah, I think we're closing up.
Okay,
so,
awesome.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for having me. This was incredible. I actually I've done a lot of these types of talks at like libraries and churches and things like that, but I've never done them at a funeral home, and I would love to do them at more funeral homes. So thank you for this opportunity. This was great. Yeah. And I hope you learned. I hope you learned a lot, and I hope you also, if you want more stories, because I know people are always like thirsting for the stories. You can get that at the podcast, and you can also look up our website, and we have a lot more information if this is something that piques your interest. So,
Perfect.
yeah.
Beautiful. We will end on that note.
Awesome.
Thank you so much, Isabel.
Yeah, no problem.